software development has never been for everyone. I think coding is for everyone. Everyone should learn to code to some extent. But beyond, it's sort of like, writing or reading. Not everyone has to become a professional writer. Not everyone has to become a professional software developer. But if that's what you want to do, I would, 100% encourage you to do that.
Welcome back to the freeCodeCamp podcast. I'm Quincy Larson, teacher and founder of freeCodeCamp.org. Each week, we're bringing you insight from developers, founders, and ambitious people in tech. This week, we're talking with YK Sugi. He's a software engineer and prolific YouTube computer science tutorial creator. He's worked at Google, Microsoft. He runs the CS Dojo channel on YouTube, and he shares so many of his insights on software development, AI, and the developer career progressions that are possible when you're entering the space. So be sure to check out his channel, but we've got the man right here in our midst. YK, how's it going, man?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk with you. It's been many years since you and I talked synchronously, and I'm a big fan of your insights that you share on your channel, and I'm excited to learn more from you.
Well, I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's start talking, just jump right into talking about AI, because AI is something that you have been working very closely with. You're over at SourceGraph, which has created the Cody kind of like, if you Copilot alternative, if you will. It's basically an AI tool that helps you write code more. It helps with auto completion and probably helps with a lot more stuff. But before we talk about Cody, I'm really interested in your thoughts on AI. And the question that I get the most is AI coming for developer jobs? Are we all developers just going to be out, working as Walmart greeters, greeting people as they come into the Walmart because there's no more software development to be done and AI can just take it all from there? What are your thoughts on this?
So the short answer is no, AI is not quite ready to do that. And I say, not just because of my feelings, but because of facts. If you look at, the most advanced AI agents that are, supposedly able to do, sort of software engineering tasks autonomously, they are able to solve, about like 20-ish% of real world software engineering issues. And that's pretty cool. But, if you think about it like self-driving, if a company said our self-driving system is able to drive on 20% of public roads, that's pretty cool, but that's not quite enough to, replace driving completely.
Yeah, and I mean, I presume that those 20% that it can do are probably the easiest 20%, right?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, so just like with anything, it's probably like in software development, we have this statement that like the last, the first 90% takes 90% of the time, the last 10% takes 90% of the time too, like that basically, once you get to a certain point, it can seem like you're extremely far into the development of a tool or something like that. But the reality is that last little bit is going to take a vast majority of the time. And so even if AI tools tee up like a whole lot of things for you and do save some time, we're not talking about handing the problem over. It's the same thing we've encountered with self-driving, which is a great example. We were supposed to have self-driving cars, I don't know, like 8 or 10 years ago. Like everybody's like, they'll be right here. They're done basically. And yes, we do have, these extremely limited self-driving in specific cities where they've done a ton of training and stuff like that. But I would never just like turn on a car and just like let it drive on the road. Like I would be absolutely terrified to do that, knowing the limitations that I've heard about, just talking with software developers and things like that. And similarly, to do the same thing with a code base and entrust your production app to an AI seems very reckless at this point, based on what we know about these systems. Okay, so you said 20% can be done. Maybe you can talk about what AI is currently capable of in terms of just going about like developing software on its own, not with a human in the loop.
Right. So from my experience, it is able to do simple tasks. Let's say you have a class of, with a bunch of methods. You have a file of, let's say 300 files or 300 lines, and you have a couple of those, and you need to be able to kind of look at them, maybe modify a single function, add a function to that existing class. AI should be able to do that, as long as the function is simple enough. But if it's, more involved, let's say, if it's sort of like you look at the front end, look at where in the back end, it calls exactly, and then you need to modify the back end, and then make sure, it's displayed correctly on the front end. That's probably too hard. So that's kind of the line. But the way, I like to think about it is really like an assistant. That's kind of, I think that's how most people use AI today for coding, with ChatGPT, Claude, things like that. It's not really meant to replace our jobs or, software engineering per se. It's meant to help us, really.
Yeah. So helpful indeed. I use GPT I like to say that I talk to GPT more than I talk to any human being in my life other than my wife. And I spend probably like an hour a day almost talking to it, trying to get things done, trying to get my bash scripts to run properly, trying to figure out what's wrong with my SQL join statement or whatever it is that I'm working on at any given moment. It's incredibly helpful for those kinds of tasks. But at the same time, I wouldn't just let it loose in my code base and give it high level complex interactions that I would potentially give a developer on our team. I'd say hey, we need, here's a very basic user story. See if you can build this out. I'm pretty sure if I gave that sort of user story to GPT, even 4.0, which is, the one that I'm using, it would just fall flat on its face. It probably would, stumble, and I'd probably spend almost as much time fixing what it did as I would just trying to create the feature from whole cloth myself. Is that kind of how you feel at this point? What are the main things that developers are using AI tools like Cody for, or using GPT-4, or using the many other LLMs that are out there for?
Right. So sort of historically, not that history is that long, but historically speaking, it started with autocomplete. I think a lot of people are already familiar with Copilot, and I've asked a lot of developers about it, but it turns out the most popular sort of AI tool again is these chat systems, ChatGPT. I think some people use Claude now, and to me it's kind of understandable. These autocomplete systems, they're not very smart. It's in my opinion a lot more helpful to get let's say 10 lines of code that's pretty solid than 3 lines of code that are not that helpful or relevant. So that seems like the most common use case for AI systems.
What are some things that you do when you're coding in terms of using? And so you said chatbots are kind of like the first user experience, but can you talk about some other emerging, designs, I guess, how the AI is actually interacting with the code instead of just having an interface where you're prompting the AI and it's giving you some sort of response that you can then copy and paste?
Right. So there are different ways of doing it. Autocomplete is obviously one of them. But other than that, I like to see as a version of chat, or it's something you can do with different chats combined together. So an example of this is a feature where you select a piece of code and then say, can you modify this code for me? Or this feature that we have, and some other coding assistants have too, where you get a piece of code, and instead of copy and pasting, you just say apply this code. It is a little bit of magic. And then more recently, as I mentioned, we have these agentic, people call it, applications where they just do stuff for you. They might create a PR for you. They might create tests for you without you necessarily doing anything.
Yeah. So you just running in the background, I wrote some code, and it's gonna look at my code, and it's gonna say, okay, here are some tests to ensure that this code doesn't fail in the future.
Right. There are AI applications that do that too.
Okay, so it's kind of like following behind you, like your silent, QA engineer almost. Can it like can these systems like raise, like, oh hey, you might have a memory leak here or something like that? Can they spot those kinds of issues and bring them to your attention?
Right. So there are systems that can do that. I think we are kind of jumping a little bit into the future, and is the way I like to see it is, we have the present, the past, and the future, right? The past, as I mentioned, autocomplete. That's pretty much it. The present is chat systems where people start the conversation. They say, I want this function, or I want to modify it this way, or I want this kind of PR. And then we are moving into, I would say, from this year to probably next year. And later is these systems where AI just does it for you. You can think of it as CI/CD systems where, whenever you have a PR or whenever you have a commit, AI checks things for you. It's not 100%, but it's just, a nice system to have for like, security checks or, just general PR checks, stuff like that.
Okay. So just for anybody listening who doesn't know what CI/CD is, continuous integration, continuous delivery system, basically like a build server kind of that builds your code and make sure everything runs, make sure the tasks pass, and then if everything works, then it'll deploy it, or it'll give you the green light to manually deploy it. But it's a way of catching things like, what was that blue screen of death that hit everybody a while back? What was the name of that company? But do you remember what it was called? It's like CrowdStrike. That's it.
Right.
CrowdStrike apparently doesn't use CI/CD because they deployed something that ended up like having a 100% fail rate, right? So CI/CD is a tool for preventing you from deploying code that is going to just crash everybody's computers, right? Or crash all your servers. So and then when you mention PR, it's just pull request. Basically, when you want to make a code change to a code base, GitHub invented this thing called a pull request where you can basically say, hey, here's my code, look at this, and if it looks good, merge it into the code base. So, sorry, I just want to make sure everybody understands those terms because we don't like to introduce too many acronyms at once.
Right.
Okay, so just to be clear, the first era was autocomplete, kind of like what Copilot is doing, where you're starting to type and it's like, oh, hey, this function looks similar. Like, is this what you want? And then you can like, no, that's not exactly what I want. And you can just ignore it. Or you can be like, oh, that's exactly what I want. Hit tab and it's just like, and then you move on to the next task, the next part of the code that you're writing, right? It, potentially huge time save, but also potential problem when you have like lazy people that are just like not really like looking at what it's doing and are introducing all kinds of problems that they're going to have to later debug. But I would say on a whole, net positive for a lot of developers. A lot of developers swear by it. A lot of developers, like I talked to the Primogen, and he was just like, no, I ripped it out. It was making me a worse developer. So it really depends on like where you are in your developer journey, what you're trying to accomplish. But these can be like very powerful productivity building tools.
So
Second era. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I have a quick thing to say about that. There is a little bit of insight from actually, a Cody customer, I should say, that I got recently, where senior developers actually are apparently less likely to accept autocomplete suggestions than junior developers, which is kind of interesting to me because you might expect the opposite. But the explanation I got was, junior developers, they're I guess less skeptical of the suggestions. They just like click accept on anything pretty much, or not anything, but more likely to accept. But senior developers are more selective on what's the right thing to insert.
Yeah, and I would imagine like a senior developer might just be like, well, I can type really fast, I can code really fast. Like this isn't quite what I want, so I'm not going to accept it and go modify it. I'm just going to type my own function out.
There's probably some.
Whereas a junior developer might be like, oh, this is almost exactly what I want. I'll just enter this and then I'll go modify it. Yeah. But so do you just track like basically whether people actually hit the tab or whatever the key is to like complete? Yeah.
So it's in the industry, it's called completion acceptance rate, CART.
Completion acceptance rate.
Yeah. It's like, some of the tools are like at 35%. I think our tool is at 40% ish. I don't remember exactly, but
I mean, that's a ridiculously high number. That's a great batting average.
It is. I mean, I think anything above 30%, it shows that it is a helpful tool. But again, to me, it is an important tool, but at the same time, it is more kind of moving slowly into the past.
Yeah. So just to recap those 3 stages that you said, like the past, code completion, present, prompting, and the future, like kind of autonomous agents going in, like scuttling around and fixing your code base and adding little things that can, potentially optimize it or potentially make it more robust. Maybe rewrite some anti-pattern code to make it in line with best practices, things like that.
That is one way to phrase it, but the way I like to see it is where in the software development life cycle is AI helpful. So with autocomplete, it's only helpful for writing code, right? It's only helpful for like this specific part of your job, and writing code is obviously a small part of your job as a software engineer. With chat, you said prompting. I like to see of it more as chat because that's what it is. It's helpful for more areas. It's helpful for design, and research if you want to use stuff like Perplexity. It's helpful for reading code. It's helpful for writing code. So it's helpful in more areas. And then when it comes to like what's going to happen, again, later this year, next year, and so on, is the entire software development cycle. Not just writing code, not just reading code, but also testing, a little bit of debugging. Again, CI/CD, all these things.
Yeah, awesome. So with these advents, these kind of epochs in LLM powered, developer tools, where do you see this going in terms of like improving productivity for a developer? Like, I guess right now, what would you say is the productivity difference if we had to quantify it between a developer who's just coding totally analog, right? Just looking things up on Google, maybe using Stack Overflow, using freeCodeCamp as a reference, using different reference tools, and just writing code the old-fashioned way, versus somebody who is using some of these conversational tools in terms of like how much more productive. Again, if you had to coarsely quantify that, this is not an exact science by any means, but like, I guess, how much work do you think the former developer could get versus the one who's like fully contemporary tool empowered?
So that's an interesting question because we're looking at basically different groups of people here. You can categorize them as like people who are learning to code, junior developers and senior developers, and there's also a question of, are you working on a new project and like an existing project, existing code base. With a new project, let's say in general, what I've heard from people and what I've experienced myself is that you can be like 300%, 400%, multiple times more productive. It might have taken you, let's say, a week or 2 weeks to complete. Now you can complete it in a weekend kind of thing. So that's like, multiple times productivity. But for existing projects, it's not that simple. It's not just, letting AI write everything. You can't really do that with, with existing code bases like large or legacy code bases.
Yeah.
So what I've heard from customers and what I've heard from like, kind of developers in general is people can be productive, like 30, 40%-ish productive. Like if they learn to use it really, really well, I think they can be like 40%-ish productive. If they use it decently or kind of average, maybe 30%, maybe 20%.
Okay, that's super helpful. So that leads me to my next question, which is, okay, let's say somebody is 30 to 40% more productive. Does that mean that in theory we would need like the proportional amount fewer developers working at that company? Let's say they have a team of 10 people and those people are like 40% more productive. Does that mean they could just have a team of like 7 people? And I apologize, I'm not trying to do the math off the top of my head, but like, could a team of 7 people do the work that a team of 10 people used to do?
So the short answer is yes. Can a 77-person team, people, can they do the same work? When they, like, assuming they learn to use these AI tools really well, can they do the same work as a, previous 10-person team, yes. But I think the question that gets asked after that is, does that mean those 3 people will be just laid off, fired? Not necessarily, right? We're kind of yet to see what's going to happen exactly to those like 3 people, or, are we going to have more software engineers because there's more software being created? Or, is the company just going to say, okay, well, I'd rather save cost than having more features? It's a question for basically management to answer.
Okay. Do you think that like they're likely to just find more work to do? Like at every company I've ever worked at, there's always been a big pile of like, someday maybe we'll do this type work that nobody ever gets to, right?
Yep.
There's like this big bug folder. Oh, these are a bunch of known issues that nobody's ever had time. And then we'll have like a big pizza party, like sell as many bugs as you can, try to get you to work on the weekend and stuff. Frame it as a hackathon maybe. But like, do you think that there's just so much work to be done that this isn't going to be a net, decrease in the number of developers that have to work at a company? Do you think that employers will? How do you predict employers will react, I guess, to these new AI tools and the improvements in productivity that come with them?
So I think, the reality is different employers, different leadership management will react differently to this new reality. Some people will overreact. I've heard news like, we've introduced this AI system, we laid off directly because of this. But I think a lot of it is overreaction. Some management will, look at it differently. They will say, okay, if we lay off, let's say, 3 people out of the 10 people team, our competitors, they might not do that. They might keep the 10-person team, and they might have more features. They might beat us. So, we don't have to keep the 10-person team. And again, it's hard to say on average what's going to happen, but I'm slightly more optimistic towards, more software being created, leading to basically more people creating software.
Yeah. Okay, and then I guess in terms of like, so you could say, I think it's fair to say that more productive people, like, stingy employers who already don't want to hire a lot of people and are already laying people off, they may hire fewer developers. But I guess the overall growth rate of software. So one argument I've heard is the software that these smaller teams that are powered by AI that they're going to write is going to be more buggy, and it's ultimately going to necessitate a lot more maintenance over the long term, and you're going to get these kind of like Frankenstein's monster systems that just are a nightmare to keep online, but they'll be like mission critical for a lot of stuff. Like imagine all the legacy systems that we have today that are written in like COBOL, like that the unemployment offices are using and stuff like that, right? The various government agencies, various university systems. Like imagine all that code, and now imagine how it costs a fortune to maintain it. But what if it were written by like, a half-baked AI system that, instead of like a bunch of extremely skilled software engineers who had to like make everything super efficient with the extremely limited resources of their time, right? Like imagine how much more those systems would cost to maintain if instead of like looking like, like NASA's, lunar lander code base, they looked like Microsoft Windows 11 in terms of just being like this giant mess of code, right? Do you think that like the net employment of developers is actually going to go up because so much mediocre code will be written over the next few years?
So I think I'm naturally an optimistic person. At the end of the day, that is, the code quality is the responsibility of the, engineering leadership, and at the end of the day, like management in general. So if let's say if I was an engineering manager managing a team of 10, if a lot of buggy code gets shipped, that's my responsibility. I can't blame AI, right? Because I'm letting my engineers use those AI systems. So I'm optimistic that engineering managers, VPs of engineering directors, they will learn to kind of deal with this new reality and still ship high quality code. That's my hope anyway. But despite that, there will be more code, just like regardless of like if it's high quality or low quality, medium quality, there will be more code being created, and that means more maintenance to be done on those.
Yeah. Okay, so the other thing to keep in mind, and because people ask me about this constantly, and I just want to give them an exhaustive, intellectually honest answer, not just say everything's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. Just learn to code, and the jobs will come back. Like, I mean, that's what I believe. But I also want to address the questions that they often have. Do you think that the total number of developers employed right now is maybe 30 million professional developers on Earth right now in 2024? Do you think that's set to grow? And why?
Right. So, but I think it is set to grow. No one knows. That's the honest answer. But again, optimistically kind of thinking about it, more software being created and more maintenance to be done, we'll need more software developers, maybe a little bit more. It might not be like 50% more, but it might be like 10% more, 5% more, something like that. Before this recording, we were talking about interest rate. That's a big thing too. Interest rates are set to go down both in Canada and the US. And I think that's going to bring up the number of jobs for software engineers too.
Yeah, and that's something that, like the recurring character on the FreeCodeCamp podcast, federal interest rates. There's like the risk-free rate that the Fed, which is the big U.S. central bank, basically they set the interest rate, and if they move the interest rate up or down, the cost of capital changes accordingly. And so when the interest rate is high, nobody wants to do venture capital investment because they can just take their money and put it into, a bank account and get 5% guaranteed, as opposed to or like a money market or something. I actually don't know the exact amount you would get if you just put it into an extremely safe, like a government T-bill or something like that. But the point is, people are more inclined to take risks when the interest rate is like super low. And if you can get like a 0% interest rate, which we had for a long time in the U.S., Japan's actually had I've heard a slightly negative interest rate. Then you can stimulate all kinds of investment and growth and things like that. So maybe you can talk just from your perspective, and you, we're going to get into your personal background and everything. I mean, you're from Japan. You grew up until you were the age of 20. You lived in Japan and you moved over to the U.S. And Japan also has interest rates. It also has a tech sector, and I'd love to talk a little bit about software development in Japan. Even though I don't know how much you've worked in the Japanese software development industry, but your insights into that. But let's talk a little bit about interest rates.
Sure.
Because there's a very clear correlation between, big speculative investments like Uber, like Airbnb, these crazy ideas, like the scooter companies, all these different, companies that were founded during the historically low interest rate in the U.S. and the tech hiring associated with that. And then all of a sudden, interest rates go up, and a lot of developers, I think, blame AI for the unemployment, when in fact, I think a lot of people that know how these things work, that are economists or software developers that are, founding companies or managing teams of developers, they know that the cost of capital has gone up, and as a result, it's just there's been less cash lying around that you can use to hire people, and it's been riskier to hire people, right?
Definitely.
Yes. What is your perspective on interest rates? I kind of said my piece on interest rates, but what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah. So the way I look at the software engineering market over the past few years is we had basically two big things. One is the interest rate, the low interest rate. That's been kind of the consistent theme, I guess, of the economy for a while. Not so much recently. And then the other is COVID and kind of COVID-related spending, COVID-related growth, and with the combination of both, I think it was 2019, 2020, 2021, the economy was good. For software engineers, I would say, the job market was good for software engineers. Whether you were a junior or senior, it was relatively easy back then to get a job as a software engineer. I think pretty much no matter where you are in the world. But with kind of winding down of COVID and kind of the economy getting back to normal per se, and the interest rate going up at the same time, that's kind of been, I don't know what the word is, winding down. Basically, there are a lot fewer software engineer jobs because of that. It's nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. But that's how I see it. And one thing I wanted to say about the software engineering job market is it's different based on whether you're a senior or junior as well. A couple of years ago, it was pretty easy to get into the industry, break into the industry, but now it's much harder. I would say a decent number of job postings for senior and above positions, but it's been really, really hard for juniors. It's not impossible, but still, it's been pretty tough.
Yeah, and maybe you can talk about like why you think that is. Like for junior developers, why has it gotten harder?
So I think it is a combination of things. AI actually comes into this part of the conversation a little bit more. If you look at the general software engineering job market, I think the main character there is as you said, the interest rate. But when you look at juniors side of things specifically, the way I would kind of think about it is if there's an engineering manager again running a team of 10 people, they might have thought, okay, let's have eight seniors, 2 juniors. But now they might say, why do we need 2 juniors? When we can let some of that work, be done by AI. Not everything, but things like writing tests or writing simple features, we can have AI do that. So why do we need 2 juniors? Not every manager will say that, but some have said that. I think that's part of the reason that goes into it.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And what do you think the remedy for that is if you are somebody who's learning to code, if you are somebody coming from a different field, or if you're somebody who literally has no background in software development or even a related industry? Like I worked as a teacher and a school director, and I just learned to code just Googling things and using library books and free online resources and things like that. Like, how do you think things have changed from 2010, 2011 when I was learning to code and now? Because you've taught a lot of people these skills. You have like a Python course that I don't know, like 8 million people have viewed or something like that, right? Like, how have things changed over the past 12 years or so?
It's gotten tough. That's just the reality. I think it's again a combination of different things. Market factors, we've already talked about it. AI factors, we've already talked about it. Another factor is just kind of this industry getting more popular in a way. Like 10 years ago, fewer people were talking about getting into tech. I think there were fewer resources to learn these skills. So that was tough in that way. But at the same time, there were fewer people doing it, so less competition, much easier to get into the industry. Now, what people honestly ask is like, if there are so many, if there are a decent number of senior positions available, but not so many junior positions, like how do you get seniors? Like you need to have juniors to have seniors, right? Like that's a good question. And I think my answer to that is, if you're just getting started, you could argue about like, is it the right thing? But that's just the reality. So if you were starting, I would say, do as much as you can on your own. Like, let's say if you were a teacher, keep your job. I think that's a good job to have, right? But then, think about how you can use coding in your job, and maybe you can automate some of your tasks. Maybe automate some of your cheating detection, or like copying detection, things, or maybe homework assignment. How to collect homework. If you find some of your like tasks at work or kind of your real regular life repetitive or boring, think about like how you can automate that stuff with coding.
Yeah, I mean, and that was exactly what I did as a teacher, was just automating back office boring grade reports stuff, attendance reports, stuff that we had to turn over to the federal government, like records and stuff, because we had a lot of students from outside the US. Okay, that's good advice. Like, basically, don't quit your day job. Just see how you can incorporate developer skills into your current job, and then kind of like taper in the direction of becoming more and more technical from there.
Exactly. And I want to share like a few quick stories here, if that's okay. So
please.
It's, I want to emphasize, it's been a tough market. Like if you lost a job recently, or if you're struggling to find your first, second, third, whatever software development job, it might not be you. It might just be the market. Like normally I wouldn't say. Normally I would say, okay, work harder, you'll do better. But it's just, like uh, objectively speaking, it's been a tough market. I know someone from a pretty good university who's not able to get a software engineering job, so she started to work at a library. I know someone else who's had a software engineering job before, but he can get a job, so he started working at Starbucks. Nothing wrong with it, right? Nothing wrong with working at the library. Nothing wrong with working at Starbucks. I would totally do it, or as a teacher, or anything else, firefighter, whatever. I would say I would be, if I were in that position, I would personally be optimistic. Like I would obviously, do my job, so just so I can pay the bills, but at the same time, keep learning and keep staying optimistic, even though it's kind of hard.
Yeah. Do you think it's possible to acquire the skills to potentially skip the junior developer branding that I guess like a lot of companies like, and I've heard this from a lot of people like, oh, don't ever apply as a junior. Don't position yourself as a junior. Position yourself as a software engineer.
Yeah.
Because if you're trying to call yourself a junior, developer or something like that, a lot of teams don't want a junior developer. So it's kind of like pretending that, faking it till you make it, so to speak, at least in terms of, and you may have the ability of a senior engineer, but you need someone to take a chance on you and give you that responsibility so you can prove that you can perform, right?
Yeah, that is a tough question. I think, 10 years ago, I would have said, it's fine to call yourself a junior developer, just basically call yourself at the right skill level. But, today's market is so tough. I don't know what I would say exactly, but I would definitely say, try to build up your skills so that you can like become real, senior, maybe not senior, but, software engineer, not junior developer. And that could come from, building personal projects. That could come from things like looking at open source projects, learning from them, contributing to them, stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something that I'm always quick to encourage people to do is to contribute to open source projects. It's very similar to working as a remote developer. You're reading essentially specs, GitHub issues, things like that. You're going and you're implementing fixes. You're working with large legacy code bases. You're doing pretty much everything that you would do if you worked at a team, other than maybe like the, stand-up meetings and or which we now call huddle. We don't call them stand-up meetings anymore because somebody pointed out that stand-up is an ableist term. But basically, the frequent meetings and having like performance reviews and all those other kind of like office space type things that happen when you're actually working in a job as opposed to working as a volunteer for an open source project. But that can definitely be a way to bolster your reputation. I want to ask you a question about like skill acquisition because you're a teacher. You're prolific in having taught so many people computer science concepts through your YouTube channel. You have said that like even if you give people like a deterministic path to learning to code, very few people will actually take you up on it because it's so much work. Can we talk about like what proportion, like let's say you had 100 people. You just grabbed a sampling of 100 people who, let's say they were like, 25, 30 years old, 40, 35 years old maybe. Like, so they're still in the period of their life where it's much more common to transition careers. It can be done at any age. I've talked to developers in their 50s who have transitioned. And I imagine there are lots of developers out there, even in their 60s, who've transitioned into software development. But it's much more common. Like the median age of somebody using freeCodeCamp, for example, is 30. So let's say you've got an audience of people, we'll just say for the sake of simplicity, they're North Americans, and they are about 30 years old, and you've somehow managed to convince them all to sit in this big lecture hall with you, and you are about to give them the keys to the kingdom, how to become a developer, and it is a deterministic path. What proportion of those people do you think would actually do it?
Right. So I'm just going to assume they're all motivated. They're interested in this path. It depends on their life situation and everything, but I would say, if we did this thing like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I'm confident that I can get like 80, 90% of the people, through and, kind of get into the industry at least. They might quit later, but at least, get started. If we did it today, I think the number would be much lower. I want to say 50%, 60%, like optimistically maybe 60%, if the economy gets a little bit better next year, like 65, 70% at most, I would say.
Okay.
It's a,
Let's say like they're not necessarily motivated. They have average motivation. Okay, but they have perfect learning resources. Let's say like FreeCodeCamp, highly optimized, more than 50,000 GitHub issues, pull requests, like tiny refinements to the core curriculum and things like that, right? And at least 40,000 that I've personally documented have gone through and gotten their first developer job after completing FreeCodeCamp, right? So let's say that it was like perfect FreeCodeCamp, that it was like that it had been optimized to the point that it was literally like the shortest path to a developer job. What proportion of people do you think would have the motivation out of the average audience? Okay, not just super high motivated, like the kind of kids that get into Stanford and stuff like that, but like typical people that have average level of motivation that face economic realities like paying the rent and having to deal with like car trouble or healthcare related things that come up and stuff like that. What proportion of those typical North Americans, based on your personal experience, having worked with a lot of learners, would have the motivation to power through all that?
Probably less than half.
Less than half.
Yeah.
Or
like just go through the curriculum.
I mean, just to go through everything and the process of like job searching and all that stuff.
I mean, just to go through the curriculum, I would imagine it's less than half. Because I remember, with a Udemy course I had, people bought the course, but only like 20% completed it. And I think that's probably like average for courses like that.
Yeah, and that's a course that people are paying money for. When you pay money for a book, you feel a little bit more inclined to actually read it than when you check a book out from the library or when it's just sitting on somebody's coffee table.
And to be fair, like they don't have to finish the whole course. They can like go to other courses. They can finish kind of their path that way. So, let's say half of those people, finished the path they got started on, right? Like people who bought the course. So, if they don't have like enough motivation to, actually like buy the course or get started, maybe like much less than half.
I'll go ahead and take a moment to break the fourth wall and talk to the audience here. If you've listened this far into this kind of pedantic, down in the details conversation about the developer job market, about developer training and things like that, you are probably already like way above average in motivation and interest in getting a developer job. So hang in there and keep it up, because there are developer jobs out there. I don't think it's just the economy. That is one thing. Like the economy is, from a lot of metrics, actually doing reasonably well. Employment's at a relatively low, level. Inflation seems to have gone down dramatically after the greedflation, with like all the food companies colluding to like raise the price of groceries and stuff. We've talked about this a lot. It's a huge point of rage for me personally. But like, if you are actually listening to this and like thinking about like these things actively and doing research and watching like lectures about like how the interest rate has affected hiring, the dynamics of companies, like why they decide to lay people off, the hurting among even like CEOs and stuff like that. Elon Musk fired everybody from Twitter. He's the greatest firer or whatever, right? Like everybody else is like, oh, we can get away with that too. And suddenly there's these cascading, layoffs. Right? Even Apple, which I would always say like FreeCodeCamp's never done a layoff. And I'd always say like, hey, Apple's a really well-run company. They've never done a layoff since like the 1990s or something like that. They laid off some small percentage of their workforce. Even Apple has done a layoff now. Right? And I think a lot of it, personally, my thinking on this is a lot of it is they just overhired during the pandemic. And if you look at the actual developer total number of job openings and job listings, it is improving. You've done on your channel, I think you published a video where you showed some of the graphs and stuff. During the pandemic, it was like just an aberrational period. We had extremely low interest rates, basically 0% interest rates. We had a whole bunch of cash that was being injected into companies. We had dramatically increasing prices for everything, which was kind of like a smokescreen of like, oh, supply line logistics and stuff like that. But why did the Netflix price go up so dramatically? That's not related to supply lines, right? Maybe they could argue that, oh, it's just more expensive to produce content because of, the pandemic restrictions and all this stuff. But basically, it was like a perfect storm of hiring during the pandemic, and the fact that you could like bring people on remote. And now there's like been this big backlash against remote work. You work remotely, right?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, and I work remotely. The whole FreeCodeCamp team is remote, and yet I have lots of friends who work at companies like, Dell, work at companies like, Google, Microsoft. Like a lot of these companies are calling people back to the office and saying, you have to work or else we're going to lay you off. So I think a lot of the layoffs are probably also related to people not wanting to go back to the office, because you can work if you're a disciplined person, you can work just as productively from home, perhaps accomplishing even more, because you don't have the commute and all the other, you don't have to like figure out what you're going to wear and do all this other stuff, right? You can just sit down and get the work done. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. This is supposed to be an interview and not me just going on a rant. So let's jump back over to what you were talking about. I want to hear some other observations that you have about the job market. And do you think that, when do you think hiring is going to recover? Let's say interest rates don't go back down. They're actually at about the median rate historically. I'm not sure what the interest rate for the USA. I think it's been about 5 for most of history. I mean, there were certain spikes where it went up dramatically. And again, this is not an economics podcast, so I don't want to act like I'm an economist or anything like that, because I'm not. But, in the 90s, it was like 7% for a while. It's just really after 2000 that it stayed pretty low. 2006, 2007, it was up over 5%. So, 5%, it may stay here for a while. Do you think that hiring will recover? What are your predictions?
I mean, my prediction, I feel like all my predictions are pretty much, on the optimistic side. I would expect the interest rate to go down, maybe not to 0, but at least, lower than this. Because if you look at basically recent, inflation rates, both in the US and Canada, it's been reasonable. It hasn't been crazy like, it was a couple of years ago. So my hope and my, best educated guess is that interest rates will go down and the economy and the job market will come back.
Yeah. Okay. So talking about AI and its implications for developers over the next 5 years, which I understand in LLM world, that's like an eternity, because LLMs weren't even like mature. I mean, if you even call it what they are now mature, I consider them to be pretty mature because they're very useful. And I do think that they're going to continue to improve. Let's say hypothetically they do continue to improve, as like optimists predict, and that there's not some fundamental like, oh, we ran out of data to feed into them, or there's just diminishing returns beyond a certain point. Let's say they do continue to improve at a steady clip. What will software development look like 5 years from now?
So I think it'll be, first of all, more fun, in my opinion. Basically, less kind of worrying about line by line coding and more about, I want this function that does this thing. And that doesn't mean your software engineering skills, your coding skills are going to go out of style or they're going to be useless. They're still going to be useful, but in a different way. It's sort of like the way I like to think about it is, every software engineer becomes more like a tech lead. A tech lead becomes more like a, engineering manager. Basically, every person will need to think at a higher level. And that might be boring to some people, right? Like some people might be passionate about like, writing every single character of code. That's fine if you want to do it that way still. But, the most productive people will kind of move on to this new way of thinking about coding.
Yeah. So I often liken it to kind of like a rising tide, like the knowledge you have to have, the systems knowledge, the domain expertise you have to have for the different fields you're working in. Like you could say like back in like the 90s when all this stuff was new, any kid who had an internet connection could, and basically some experience building like GeoCities pages or building Neopets websites or something like that, right? They could potentially build like a company website and get paid a few $1,000 by some company to create like a web presence for that company, right? Well, obviously, like an AI can do that now, right? You don't even need to use AI. You could just use like some template and some boilerplate and stuff like that, and somebody can slap it together. Like a non-technical person following step-by-step instructions or some sort of like push-button application could be deployed. So that's not a job that you can do anymore. Like those opportunities are not there anymore. You're not going to make thousands of dollars building company websites. Generally, there might be some people who figured it out and they may have exceptional people skills and they may have an exceptional network of small businesses who don't realize that there are these powerful tools that exist that can basically do it for them. Or maybe they do need something a little more bespoke. But like, so I think of it as like a rising tide. Like no longer will those skills pay the bills. So you have to keep climbing higher and higher up as that kind of water level of tooling rises. But at the same time, do you think like somebody, computer science skills, you've taught a lot of computer science. My understanding is you actually don't have a background in computer science academically. You study statistics, but that is in some ways even more useful because you have like all this like hardcore mathematical background that allows you to better appreciate and better understand, things like LLMs. But do you think that those skills, the more conceptual skills are going to help people climb higher and higher as this rising tide, kind of like the tools get better?
Conceptual skills like use like computer science and
like understanding, what goes into a good database, for example, like ACID transactions or understanding, all the different normal forms in a database, understanding a lot of the kind of classical computer science concepts that you would be exposed to if you got a CS degree.
Right. So I think, like I said, your classical computer science knowledge, that's still going to be useful, and that's it. I feel like it's the same thing as today, right? Like, if people ask me like, is the computer science knowledge useful for software developers? I would say yes. I mean, maybe not like every moment, not for every line of code that you write, but it is useful for, designing your systems in an efficient way, for writing your code so that it's more maintainable, testable, and all of these things. And that's not going to change. I think what will change is the way people kind of acquire that knowledge. Now people need to kind of, or let's say 5 years ago, people needed to like read books or watch videos to learn these concepts. But now you can just ask and say, I'm building this system. What knowledge do I have to have? And, LLMs will be able to like give you pretty accurate, answers to that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like I was trying to get better at swimming, and I could pay for swimming classes. And I probably will once I get a little more advanced, but I didn't want to just pay money and like suck at swimming. I've known how to swim since a kid, but I just didn't know like all the different strokes and stuff like that. And I almost kind of like built myself like a study plan, just talking with GPT-4o, like, okay, which stroke should I learn? Okay, like what are the different aspects of the stroke that are generally found to be difficult? Okay, can you recommend some videos and some books that are short articles? I don't know if people write books about swimming. It'd be a hard thing to convey through text, but like different resources. And I was able to kind of like build like an entire like reading list, so to speak. So I watch those, I do, and then I go to the pool and swim with my kids and try to like incorporate a lot of that insight into my swimming. So yeah, I definitely see what you mean. Like in the future, you may not have just in time, like I always reference like the Matrix when Trinity's like, I need to learn how to fly this specific type of helicopter, and it just gets uploaded into her brain, and it's like she spent like 100 hours or maybe 1,000 hours of flight time or something like that, learning all the different controls and getting a feel for like how to like maneuver the helicopter and stuff like that. And she like in a few seconds she gets it right. Like that is like the idealized perfect education, when the second you need something you can just instantly have it just in time, right? And it's very quick and it's easy and it's interactive and it works, right? You can fly that helicopter as though you were a seasoned helicopter pilot. That may never happen. We don't know. It might happen within the next 200 years. But
yeah, I mean, for that like analogy, I would say you still have to fly the helicopter, right? Like you still have to like swim. You can't just ask ChatGPT to kind of do it for you. Like ChatGPT can't swim for you, or it can't fly a helicopter for you, at least not yet. So I think that's you still have to like put in the work.
Yeah, but telling you what work you need to put in is very useful, right? Like freeCodeCamp, like we pride ourselves on being a single linear curriculum that is the shortest path to the developer skills you need to go out and work as a professional software engineer, right? And we're proud to be constantly refining and tweaking, and there are going to be some major announcements for those of you listening. Preview, freeCodeCamp's 10th birthday is coming up, and we're gonna be announcing some major improvements to the core curriculum. But we're very proud to kind of offer that shortest path, but that is specifically for becoming a software developer. There are so many different skills, so many different careers that are more specific than that, where you might want to complement like what you're learning on freeCodeCamp or what you're learning from watching, CS Dojo YouTube videos and things like that, with just like a random assortment of like GPT can pull out like the most random resource. Like, hey, this is a video that is very esoteric, but it seems to be well received by people who are watching it. And it came up highly in YouTube's recommendation, and it's specifically this topic that I think you should learn. So we do have kind of that tutoring, that virtual tutor who has the benefit of having read all the books and read the transcripts of all the videos and everything like that, who can make recommendations and kind of like tie things together and create kind of a pathway for you. So do you think that that's going to speed up learning to code?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. So if I was learning to code, today, what I would do is, first of all, I would kind of think about why do I want to learn it? Like this is the question for you, right? Like, do you want to learn it just because you're interested in it? You want to use it as part of your job or as a hobby or, to get a job? And if your goal is to get a job, then think about like, how can you do that? Like, what type of jobs are available in your local market? You probably want to start with a local job. Is it Java jobs? Is it JavaScript? Is it, C#? It really depends on your local market. So I would look into that. And then based on that, I would ask an LLM, probably ChatGPT, like, what do I need to learn? Can you come up with a roadmap? And then kind of go from there. And one thing to be careful about is the cutoff date, because ChatGPT, these LLMs, don't necessarily have the up-to-date knowledge. So if you want to, learn about like resources that are more recent, maybe that were published early this year and stuff like that, then you might need to look at something else.
Yeah, well, that's really helpful to have your insights into how you would learn to code if you learned today. What I want to move into is learning a little bit more about you. We've heard so much about you, your thoughts on AI, on the job market, on learning to code, but I'm really curious to learn a little bit more about you. I know a little bit because we have talked over the years. Your reputation precedes you. I've watched tons of your videos on YouTube. But my understanding is you grew up in Japan and you moved to Canada when you were 20 years old and you studied statistics, and then you worked at Microsoft, you worked at Google, you've done a whole lot. You just focused on your YouTube channel for a while where that was like your sole focus. And now, of course, you're working as a developer advocate for SourceGraph, creators of Cody, that AI tool we were talking about earlier for coding. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what got you into tech and how you learned to code. Right.
I learned to code first through MATLAB, I remember.
MATLAB.
I was taking, it was in a physics class, and we were supposed to write some MATLAB to do, I guess, simulations, stuff like that. And I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was, my first impression of coding in general was it's kind of like math. It's very logical. So that kind of clicked naturally for me. And did you have like any questions about?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm curious, like, if you can go into more detail, like, so you just kind of learned a little bit in class, but like that is scratching the surface. MATLAB, building some sort of physics model or something is very different from building, a full stack web app or something like that.
Right.
Like, what did you do once you had that first initial, like, I kind of like it. It's logical. It's like math. How did you proceed to extend your programming skills to the point that you can potentially get a job at Microsoft? Or I think it was like an internship as a software developer. Like that is not an easy accomplishment.
Right. So it was, sort of a long journey. I started with MATLAB, but then I started to learn mostly on my own. I took a few computer science classes, but it was mostly about just Googling stuff. And I don't remember exactly what I asked, but, it was stuff like, and it was a pre-FreeCodeCamp, I should say. it was stuff like, what programming languages should I learn? And like, what programming languages even exist? And just basic questions like that. I just Googled everything. Now, if I was doing the same thing, I might ChatGPT everything, but, same sort of thing, right? And then I would say, what should I learn? And I found that Ruby is an interesting language. So I started to learn it a little bit. Python, I started to learn it. And I think there is a little bit of continuity with everything I've done. So, with MATLAB, it was more physics, math oriented. Python, it's, more data, a little bit of machine learning, but, it's not that far from MATLAB, in my opinion. Like language wise, it's very different, but conceptually, it's not that far. And then I basically went from there.
Yeah. And you famously, got a job at Google, which is not an easy task. It's like the hardest. Like my understanding from talking to Google is they receive I think 10,000 applications a day or some crazy number that they have to sift through. They're incredibly selective. You don't even have a computer science degree. You studied statistics. You have internships at Microsoft. But how did you go about applying to Google, and what gave you the confidence to apply?
Right. So first of all, I applied many times. I didn't get it most of the times I applied. But I remember, the time I got it, it was through sort of an in-person connection. I mean, not quite connection, but I remember Google recruiters were visiting my university. So I guess I had kind of a chance to, meet them in person. And I remember this, what happened that day. They were having women in computer science events. So I was like, okay, I guess I'll go there. I support the cause. And then they were like, are you a woman in tech? And I was like, no. And they were like, okay, this event is for women only. And I think it might have been organized by Google. I'm not sure. But then I was like, okay, it was on the second floor. So I went downstairs, and then I saw recruiters at Google, recruiters from Google there. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and, just print my resume and give it to them. And I remember distinctly that I saw another student there, I think a computer science student in the computer science lab, where I went to print my resume. And I was like, I think he was like, oh, what are you doing? I was like, oh, I'm just printing my resume, give it to Google. And I was like, oh, you should do it too. And he was like, no, I'm not good enough for it. And I printed my resume. He didn't. That's one of the reasons why I got a job there.
So you think that if your friend had a little more confidence, he might have been able to also get a job at Google?
That's definitely possible. But
yeah.
What I know for sure is that he didn't get it. Without giving a resume, you're I'm sure that you're not gonna get it.
Yeah. So, that makes sense. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you get a job at Google right out of college. I'm sure your family was thrilled. I'm sure you were over the moon because the compensation is quite good, and you get to work with a lot of really brilliant people. What was your experience like there?
I would say it was, that experience really built my foundational knowledge as a software engineer because, I didn't study computer science. I was able to get it partly because of my background. They were sort of looking for a data analyst, software engineer type role person. The role itself was officially called software engineer, but, it was a combination of both those things. But when it came to computer science, software engineering, I felt like I was lacking compared to, other average computer science graduate who went to Google. So I basically spent, pretty much my entire time there kind of catching up to other computer science graduates.
Yeah. And at some point you made the decision to leave and to focus on your YouTube channel. Maybe you can talk about the origins of your YouTube channel and how it built up so much momentum that you were doing this crazy thing, leaving this very stable, very good job to focus on your YouTube channel.
Yeah, so, I've thought about it Obviously, I thought about it before I made that decision, but it was a personal decision. That's the way I like to see it. Um, First of all, I started the channel before I, started at Google. I was like, okay, I want to do this YouTube thing, see how it goes. And I enjoyed kind of talking about it, talking about tech, computer science, educating people. So I started the, YouTube channel on a part-time basis, actually kind of on a full-time basis before I started my job. And then I was running out of money. So I was like, okay, I gotta start my job. Um, and then after 1 year or so of, running it part-time and kind of creating courses on different platforms, I thought, this is what I want to do. I mean, it wasn't necessarily like a financial decision. It was more of, yeah, as I said, a personal decision. Like I kind of asked myself, how do I want to spend my, my time sitting at the computer all day, like coding, or, educating? And I decided to go with, educating and making videos.
Yeah, awesome. And then, so you've developed a ton of videos over the years. What inspired you to go back and get a job as, my understanding is you're a developer advocate now?
Right.
Yeah. First of all, what is developer advocacy for those of who have never heard of such a job?
Yeah. The way I like to see developer advocacy is it's pretty much exactly the same thing as what I've done as a YouTuber. It's educating developers, creating content for them, listening to them also, to understand what they need. And the reason why I wanted to kind of go into it is partly because I wanted to work with a team. I was working on my own on my YouTube channel. So I wanted to kind of have that experience of working with a team. And I wanted basically more inspiration, more learning for myself so I can kind of educate developers, in a much better way too. Yeah, so again, that was a personal decision too.
Awesome. Yeah, well, one thing that I'm really intrigued by is the fact that you have this unique perspective, both having worked as a developer and having worked as a developer advocate for an AI tool company that helps developers. We talked about some of the ways that AI might affect the workforce going forward. If you were like a little earlier in your career and you were worried about AI, what message would you send back to yourself back in time? Let's say like YK Sugi was just graduating in 2024. Right. And like as far as AI proofing your career and making sure that, like what would you learn? What would you focus on to make sure that you are not like, that you have skills that are not just done by AI a year or two from now, right?
Yeah, I mean, if I wouldn't send any message, to be honest, except for like buy NVIDIA and just like silly stuff like that. Because I happen to have focused on, I feel like, the right things, like, statistics background helps with understanding these systems, a little bit of math, a little bit of computer science. I think it's a good combination to have. If I was telling people in like a similar situation today, I would say understand what you're interested in and understand what the market needs. And, you want to try to find a combination of those things. It's kind of really general advice, but I think it is helpful advice.
Yeah. You've talked about, as a creator, finding your first 20 engaged followers. Let's say somebody who's watching this and they're really interested in software development and they would like to do what you've done with your CS Dojo YouTube channel and all the other things you've done on social media. How would you recommend that they go about finding those first 20 like true fans that they can use to kind of build upon, to build an audience of people learning from them?
Right. So, it depends on what you want to talk about. It depends on like who your target audience is, but basically you want to find those people first before you create your content. That's my opinion. Like if you could just start your YouTube channel and start creating content for kind of just put it into the void, but normally that doesn't work, and that's because no one's going to watch them, like no matter how good they are. So make sure that you have exactly someone in mind that you want to make this piece of content for. if you talk to like a bunch of people and if you keep getting the same questions over and over again, that's a good time to, make a piece of content. If there is a piece of content that kind of solves their issues, like why do you have to create that? You can just, send them that piece of content too.
Yeah.
And like if I was getting started today, the way I would personally go about it is, like because I'm interested in AI stuff, I would just kind of look at different AI companies and then start emailing them or like messaging them, LinkedIn messaging them, whatever. And I would say, hey, I have experience creating YouTube videos. Like here are 3 videos I've created, maybe just like create those just as samples and say, I want to create a piece of content using your piece of tech. If I created it, can you take a look? So that way you have like at least one person looking at it.
Okay, so interesting. So reaching out and just saying like, hey, I want to create videos around your tools. I just want feedback, right? I'm not necessarily asking for money or anything like that. I'm not asking to have sponsorships and do a shout out or anything like that. I just want like basically impressing those people that are already working at those companies so they take you seriously and maybe they tweet it out later like, hey, this person gets what Cody's useful for, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. So the reason why I say that is because, again, if you just create a piece of content, and shared it, let's say on LinkedIn, maybe one person watch it, but no one might care. But if you want, if you create it for a specific person or specific company, then they'll care. They said they're going to watch it, right? So it's, this idea of like, again, getting the audience before creating content.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So one of the hardest parts of being a developer advocate or just being a creator in general on the web is like day after day, you have to put stuff out there, right? Like, you can compare it to Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill. No matter how high you roll it up, one day it's going to roll back down and you're going to have to wake up and do the same thing the next day, right? Obviously, there are things that you can do like to automate your process, to simplify different tedious aspects of it. There are tools you can use like Buffer where you can like write all your tweets in one day and then you can just have them periodically go out, or you can even schedule within Twitter and LinkedIn, I think. But how do you find the motivation to put yourself out there time and time again? And like, how do you figure out something fresh and interesting to say about software development?
Yeah, it is tough. I think, a lot of it comes from talking to a lot of people, and then they give you ideas or they ask you questions. So one example of this is, recently I went to, a few conferences, hackathons, meetups, things like that. And a few people asked me like, how did you get into developer advocacy? What is developer advocacy? Like, how can I get into developer advocacy? So I was thinking about, potentially creating a piece of content around that too. So that's one thing. And another thing I would say is like reusing content is really helpful. So maybe writing a blog post and then, or let's say writing tweets, LinkedIn posts, combining a few of them into a blog post and then kind of turning that into a YouTube video by using it as a script. Things like that are helpful too.
Absolutely. What other insight or advice would you give to somebody who's listening to this who's like, hey, I want to go out and create a bunch of instructional content out there and eventually maybe get a developer advocacy role at, pretty much every big tech company has developer advocates, going to conferences, creating short tutorials that they're tweeting out and things like that. Like, what would be, in your opinion, like the shortest path and how much developer experience do you think somebody needs before they can start potentially going in this angle, this specialization?
So I would personally recommend having like at least 1 year-ish of, developer experience. Obviously, depends on the person, situation, and everything, but I think that's a good rule of thumb. And if you have more, that's great too. And the way I would start is kind of exactly what I described earlier, basically going into these different dev tool companies that may need developer advocates in the future and asking them, I'm thinking about creating a piece of content for you, or like, using your tech. Can you take a look once I create it? Yeah. And if they ignore it, that's fine. You don't have to like engage with, people who are not engaging with you. But, if you send like 100 of those, you probably get, 5, 6 maybe. So you can kind of start from there.
Awesome. Have you ever like had like low motivation or periods where you're just like, oh, like have you ever experienced burnout or anything like that? Because you're a really productive person, but I know like from personal experience, it's hard to stay at peak and always be on point. Yeah. Have you ever struggled with motivation?
I would say no, but that's just because like when I don't feel motivated, I just don't do it, and that might sound bad, but like it, so if I have a full-time job, I show up no matter what, like, that's my job. I do it. But if I'm just creating content on my own channel or like for my own Twitter or whatever, like I do it when I want to do it, no one's forcing me to do it. I don't like I feel some amount of obligation, especially if I'm getting paid for something. Like, if people paid for my course or something, I feel obligated to kind of deliver. But if not, it's free content.
Yeah. Awesome. Are there any other questions that I should have asked you, YK? Because I like threw every question I had at you, and you're just so concise and succinct at answering them that we've like already blown through everything.
Let's see. Oh, right. Yeah. I think we haven't covered stress management. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So let's talk about stress.
Yes.
So you said you just don't do things that you don't feel like doing. Like that's pretty good, simple approach. Just like don't bother doing it. And it's you're never really like working when you don't want to work, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. And, burnout, that's a huge topic. So we can get into that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's talk about it. Like, how do you manage your stress level?
It's really simple stuff, basically not overworking myself. I'm naturally kind of motivated to do excellent work. So if I wanted to put in like, 80 hours a week or something, I could, but I know that that's not sustainable. That's not good for me. That's not good for my employer or anything. Like that's not good for anyone, in my opinion. In my opinion, it's really important to have like a sustainable level of work. That might be like regular 40 hours a week, whatever you're supposed to put in, plus maybe, side project, let's say 20 hours a week on top of that, maybe 10. But if you do more than that, for most people, I don't think it's sustainable. So I think time is one, make sure to take good rest, eat well, sleep well, basic stuff. And then on top of that, kind of the mindset of not hurrying and just like taking all the time you need to kind of complete everything you need to complete. That I think that's really important.
Yeah. Okay. So essentially just like those same things that people hear all the time. Get plenty of sleep, diet, exercise, don't worry, be happy, right? It sounds like
pretty
that's,
much.
Yeah. And that has served you very well. You live in one of the happiest places in the world, Vancouver, right? I mean, that's like happy town. Like I've only been there once, but walking around, it was just like naturally a very beautiful place, very chill. The people were super polite and kind and thoughtful. And do you think that like living up there contributes? Like, have you lived in other cities? Obviously, you lived in Japan. Maybe you could contrast work culture in Japan with work culture in Canada.
Oh yeah, I mean, work culture in Japan. I've heard about it. I haven't experienced it myself. It doesn't sound good. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm here in the first place, because I don't see myself, being in that culture. And the funny thing is, like, if you look at the results, if you look at, let's say, results in the tech industry, how many like tech companies are worldwide success in Japan versus in the US? I think the results are clear, a lot more from the US. In Japan, like you have a couple of, let's say, car companies, a couple of gaming companies that are successful. That's great to have, but, it's nothing compared to the US. But when you look at the working culture, I think Japanese people in tech tend to work a lot harder.
Yeah. So you think there's diminishing returns to working really hard? I mean, Japan is kind of like a unique work culture because like a lot of that comes out of like just trying to recover from, extreme poverty after World War II and stuff like that. Like they had to build a lot of their industry through sheer force of will, in the way that the U.S. was not really that disrupted by World War
Right.
II. Like, none of the battling took place on our. We weren't like bombed like crazy, right? So we just kind of came back and just kept going, right? And to some extent, like the U.S. was the biggest beneficiary of the war ending, because we didn't have to rebuild stuff, and we already had our industry spun up and everything like that. So it could be that we're just extremely privileged in that sense. And of course, Canada, which is, you know, where you live, North America, it's basically was involved in the war to some extent, but there weren't any battles in Canada that I know of. So, like, do you think that it's just we're lucky and that we don't have to work hard, and that we're kind of coasting on decades and decades of relative prosperity and peace here in the U.S.?
So
how much of Japanese work culture is necessary, and how much of it is just vestigial momentum in that direction?
Right. So I wouldn't say hard work is, you know, a bad thing necessarily, and I wouldn't say hard work is overrated or whatever. What I would say is I think you need a combination of hard work and a good direction, and that's super important. You know, a good direction might be like 10 times more important than hard work. And what I mean by that is, let's say, you know, you're working in a, you know, software company, 200 people. If management's decisions are, you know, bad, then your hard work doesn't matter as much. Like, you might be working really, really hard on the thing that kind of dies in a couple of years. That's I think that's actually a common, you know, experience for people working in tech, right? Like, you're working on this project, and then suddenly your management says your project is dead. You know, you need to work on this other thing, and you say, oh, what happened to like my last 2 years of life? And I think that's kind of how I see Japan being, at least for the past, you know, let's say recent decades. So, you know, it's interesting that you mentioned recovery from the war. I think they did a really good job. You know, they built Honda, they built Toyota, they built, I guess, Lexus on top of Toyota, and they built, you know, these gaming companies, right? And if you think about, I don't remember exactly when, but like 2000s, maybe going into the 2010s a little bit, Japan was doing so well. You know, they had Walkman, remember?
Yeah.
You know, it was really, really popular.
Groundbreaking.
Exactly.
Changed the way people listen to music.
Yeah, I mean, they could have come up with the iPhone. You know, Walkman was pretty dominant, but then iPod came out, the iPhone came out. And then if you look at, you know, phones, like non-iPhone phones, right? You know, Samsung is probably the most popular non-iPhone phone company at this point, and a couple of Chinese companies too. But if you look at Japanese phone companies, Sony, I don't think people use it, you know, in North America. So it's sort of like they were working really, really hard on the right things right after the war. That's why they were to have like these really huge success, you know, international successes. And they still work hard, but to, you know, with fewer results coming out of it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's like a really helpful way to think of it. So, just to kind of like recapitulate what you just said, it doesn't matter how hard you work. If you're working in the wrong direction, you're just going to get
Right.
farther out in that direction, and you've kind of drifted, right? Like,
Yep.
what you really want to do is have a management team that like has a vision for what actually needs to be accomplished, and then
Yep.
harvest that extremely, you know, and I would imagine there are a lot of really excellent Japanese engineers working at U.S. companies, right, and Canadian companies, and European companies, and Chinese companies, also working very hard, but perhaps with more effective leadership.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a topic that really, really annoys me. So I can go into a little bit more.
Yeah, please.
So if you look at Toyota as an example and Honda, like these two internationally successful car companies, they were in the prime position to build like basically Tesla, or, you know, like Tesla too, you know, the next electric car companies, but they didn't. Like they saw the opportunity, you know, they saw, like, so first of all, they could have built Tesla before Tesla. They obviously didn't do that. But secondly, they could have kind of follow up on Tesla. They could have seen the success of Tesla, and they could have said, okay, we want to build, you know, electric car companies too. Like, we're doing so well as Honda, Toyota, so on. Let's do that. But they didn't do that. And now Chinese companies are doing much better on that front, electric car companies. And if you look at social media, which is like another really important.
I mean, Japan has its own equivalents. They've got like Line, and which is like WhatsApp, right? They had like LiveJournal, they had Mixi, they had a lot of different social media stuff that it never took off outside of Japan.
So Line's doing decent, I think, in like I don't remember exactly, maybe in Taiwan, maybe a little bit in Korea, in different countries like that, like Southeast Asia, but it's nowhere near like Instagram, Facebook, or Google for that matter. And the only huge international success of social media, except for the US based companies, is I guess Telegram is one, but TikTok is the one that comes to mind. That's out of China. It did come out of Japan. That annoys me as a Japanese born Canadian.
Yeah. So, do you see any promising projects or companies coming out of Japan? Like, how closely do you follow tech news in Japan?
I don't follow very closely. It's been sad. Like, so one company that comes to mind is Nintendo has been doing so well. Another one that comes to mind is this gaming company that created what's it called? It's like a really popular first-person like game RPG.
From Software. Not
From
Software. Is it From
Yeah,
Software?
From Software. Yeah, exactly. So that company's doing well. Kudos to them. But other than that, I don't see anything.
Well, I mean, gaming has always been like the best game designers in general have been in Japan. That's been like, and there are a lot of really good ones in the U.S. too. I don't want to right here in Dallas, Doom was created, but yes, Japan has always been good at cars. They've always been good at games, but that's only so big of a market, right? Like the entire video game industry is only maybe like $100 billion a year or something, right? Compare that to what the market could be for like, quantum computing or, like some sort of like LLM based, assistant tool or some other breakthrough technology that we don't even know about, like, some material science thing or something, right? Like,
I mean, so they don't have to win at everything, right? But they were winning at cars, and they have good electric, I guess electric car, not car, but like electric appliance companies. So they could have just combined those, pieces of knowledge, and they could have built the best, electric car companies in the world. They didn't. They totally missed the boat.
Well, they were very early. Like Toyota was very early to hybrid, for example. And if you think about a hybrid versus electric car, it's just like, it's actually simpler to have an electric car than to have a hybrid car. I guess I don't understand why they didn't get into that space, but like some people have theorized that it's because like they have this abundance of material that can be used to create like fuel cells, and they want to like focus on fuel cells as opposed to electric cars. I don't know if that's... Yeah.
So I think, I want to say a couple things on that. I guess that could be part of it. I think another thing is just their kind of a little bit stubborn mindset. Like, they probably said to themselves, electric cars and not, they can't sell, they're not serious. Even though Tesla was doing so well in different countries, not just in North America. But, fundamentally, it does come down to, their management, their leadership. Are they setting the right direction, or are they just, making work, their employees work hard with a less optimal, suboptimal direction?
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I hope for everybody who's listening to this, you've learned a little bit about, first of all, I mean, would you say overall that the developer job market is not dead, that AI is not going to take all of our jobs, that there's still plenty of juice to be squeezed from the beautiful orange that is the tech sector in terms of developer opportunities?
Yeah, 100%. One thing I would say is, software development has never been for everyone. I think coding is for everyone. Everyone should learn to code to some extent. But beyond, it's sort of like, writing or reading. Not everyone has to become a professional writer. Not everyone has to become a professional software developer. But if that's what you want to do, I would, 100% encourage you to do that. Is AI going to replace software engineering jobs in 30 years? No one knows, but 5 years, I don't think so.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I'm right there with you. I mean, who knows what on a long enough timeline what is going to change. The more you try to predict anything, the broader the possibilities get, and you can't predict anything with confidence out
Yep.
far enough. There's so many things that can change. I mean, you can predict that humans are probably still going to want more. They're probably going to still want faster. They're probably still going to want cheaper. They're probably still going to want better. Like, you can predict those things, but it's very difficult to predict the implementation details about how you execute on those different desires of humans, right? So, yeah. Man, I've learned so much from talking to you. I've learned a lot from watching your YouTube channel. I'm going to look forward to trying out some of these developer tools as I get time to do so, including the one that you're working with, Cody by SourceGraph. And I just want to encourage everybody who's watching this, check out YK's YouTube channel. Check out CS Dojo. And is there anything else you encourage people to do?
So 2 quick things. I already mentioned the first one, but I think staying optimistic is really important. It is hard, but my best educated guess is that the market will come back, kind of slowly over the next year or so. So, just keep learning, keep kind of preparing yourself for that. And then the second thing is, if you're curious about, Cody, it has a lot of features. Just go to Cody.dev, or just Google Cody versus Copilot. If you're curious about the differences.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks again, YK, for making time to come on the podcast. Everybody watching at home, I hope you have a fantastic week. And until next week, happy coding.